As you know, the King's College has had several locations, sort of in a way like the people of Israel wandering around in the wilderness and finding a home, but it is absolutely the case that had it not been for the third president of the King's College, Dr. Friedhelm Radandt, the King's College would not be in New York City. It was his vision to say that there should be Christian higher education in Manhattan. And so I do want to give him a proper formal introduction, but we just want to say formally on behalf of the King's College faculty, staff, and community, thank you, Dr. Radandt, for giving us the possibility of this mission and vision in New York City. Thank you. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Friedhelm Radandt to you. He is someone with whom I have had a special kinship. You know, there's the thing called the President's Club, where no matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, people that have held the office of president tend to communicate with each other and learn from one another. And so more than any other president, previous president of King's, I have sat at the feet of Dr. Radandt. I've heard his accounts of the history of the college, and I've learned a great deal from him. And he is a scholar. And so I would like to introduce him to you now. Dr. Radandt is a former professor of the University of Chicago, and he was the president of Northwestern College in Iowa, where he also served as the president of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. He became the third president of the King's College after Dr. Robert Cook, the second president, retired in 1985. He was the one, as I said, that recapitalized the vision for the New York City mission, and he was also instrumental in bringing Campus Crusade for Christ on board and worked very closely with President Stan Oaks to reopen the college in the city in 1999. He is going to give some reflections on that history, but also, more importantly, he is here to deliver a lecture on evil in the human conscience. And it is inspired by the works of two vastly different authors, the often burlesque Swiss dramatist Max Frisch and the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is well known to this campus. We're very excited to also have the family of Friedhelm and Elizabeth Radandt here. Our former First Lady, Elizabeth, is here. Welcome back to campus. Would you please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Radandt? And he is joined here by his children today, Dori Deka, Andre Radandt, the Markland family, and daughter Christine. And you will know the Markland family from Simeon, the grandson of Friedhelm Radandt, who is a student here at the King's College. Would you please join me in welcoming the whole Radandt family here today? Dr. Radandt is the author of the new book, The Radio Signal, that I have endorsed. Eric Metaxas has endorsed it, due out June 16th. Would you please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Friedhelm Radandt back to the campus of the King's College.
Well, thank you for that gracious introduction. And thank you, Mr. President, for leading the college to newer and greater heights. It's great to see you, students and faculty, for whom we pray every day. It's just a wonderful time to be here. And yes, I feel honored that our family would join us. They had the idea to making this visit to New York a family sort of reunion. It is a great day, a warm day. Now try to imagine the start of dawn on a cold winter Monday, right here in Manhattan, 56 years ago. The SS United States, that elegant and luxurious steamship that had compacted crossing the Atlantic into 6 days, is about to enter the waters of the Hudson River. On this, the 25th of January, 1960, Elizabeth and I stand on deck, eager to capture what we anticipate to be a lasting impression of the New York skyline. As the ocean liner glides past the Statue of Liberty, we can clearly make out its torch, the symbol that lights up the imaginary path to freedom. When a bit later this young immigrant couple disembarks, we are already touched by that spirit of freedom. But what if our collective, joyful sense of freedom comes into conflict with the desires and cultures of our neighbors, near and far, new and old? It's a collision that in the course of history has occurred again and again in many places around the world, often in the form of terror. That's the issue I want to address today. I will do so by talking about the post-World War II play, The Firebugs, by the often burlesque Max Frisch, and then use the ideas and thoughts from Bonhoeffer's Ethics, a name well known in these sacred halls, to evaluate the plot and the onstage actions portrayed by Frisch. But first, I cannot forgo the pleasure of this heartwarming occasion to tell you a little bit of the highlights, indeed miracles, that brought the college to this great city. I am the fellow on whose watch the King's College closed its doors. Be more correct, almost closed its doors and opened them again. King's, on the strong recommendation of an intense study by the national accounting firm of Coopers and Lybrand, today's PricewaterhouseCoopers, had decided to sell its Westchester campus and move to a new campus. When the transaction could not be completed due to opposition from the town of Briarcliff Manor, the New York Commissioner of Education, in October 1994, ordered the college closed. Before that order actually arrived, I received a phone call from Dr. Nolan, at the time the Commissioner for Higher Education in the state of New York. He wanted to give me a heads up and asked me to turn first to page 3 of his admittedly tough letter. That's the page on which he outlined the highly unusual step he had taken, namely, to keep the college's charter in full force. He added that in his opinion, the state of New York needed a college like King's, and he was praying for our reopening. With our charter in force, the college remained a legal entity. Yes, we were a closed school in terms of offering courses and enrolling students, but remained incorporated as a college. Almost dead, but not quite. As time marched on, events took place that showed me that Dr. Nolan's prayers for King's were being answered. 3 months later, all students had been successfully placed at other institutions and were able to graduate from those institutions on schedule. There were no more employees, except that some of us served in volunteer roles. As I walked into my office the last day of that year, I found on my desk an envelope that contained a check, a gift of $100,000. What startled me most were the strange words in the attached note. This gift is not to be used to cover debts or ongoing expenses, rather to explore opening the college in New York City. I did precisely as requested and proceeded to bring together a group of like-minded people. Together, we looked at various options for establishing the college in the city. To me, the monetary gift was a prophetic sign of a time to come, when King's would once again pursue its educational mission. And there was the unmistakable hint that the college's new venue might be right in the confines of the capital of the world, as one of the popes had called it. In February, or was it March, of 1995, a small group of now former King's students, presently finishing the final semester of their senior year at various other colleges, approached me with what had to be the most unlikely proposition. They wondered if they could have their credits and grades for that final semester transferred back to King's and receive their degrees as members of the class of 1995 from their alma mater, an institution that for all practical purpose qualified as a closed school. Their request startled me, but I didn't have the heart to brush them off. Rather, promised them I would take their request to the state's Commissioner for Higher Education, because he would have to give us okay. Dr. Nolan, too, didn't have the heart to say no, thinking that in the end, less than a handful of seniors, so he told me later, would sign up. What happened next defied everybody. In June 1995, about 55 graduates showed up for commencement, and the faculty was back to support those students and to march in the traditional procession in their academic robes. These students could have received their degrees from the colleges they were attending that spring semester, yet chose to identify with the King's College at this low point in its history. The graduates of 1995 are the real heroes in the battle for King's, and all of us are the beneficiaries of their faith. As I, standing on stage, congratulated each graduate, they each placed a puzzle piece into my hand. That evening, Elizabeth and I, on our dining room table, arranged this puzzle and completed it. The message taken from Scripture moved us to tears. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. How could we not see in this very special commencement that never should have taken place a sign from God? The next event to touch me profoundly occurred in the conference room of the Helmsley Commercial Realty Group in the Lincoln Building across from Grand Central Station on 42nd Street. The committee to study the possibility of reopening the King's College held its meetings there. This particular conference room is embedded in my memory because at the time it featured a huge three-dimensional poster of New York City, highlighting each institution of higher learning, a total of over 100, from Columbia University to Pratt Institute. Below the poster, the punchline read, "New York City, a college town." I quipped to the committee, none of my friends agrees with that claim. Boston maybe, but not New York City. Almost immediately, I wanted to take back my quip, and I apologized to the committee for my rash conclusions. I had attended the University of Hamburg, not a city with a reputation as a college town either. Yet I had found learning within that city to be most rewarding. And I urged the committee to consider New York City to be an ideal college town. Besides, none of the institutions of higher learning mentioned on that poster at the time was evangelical in nature. A couple of months went by. That's when Dan Kim, the commercial realtor in charge of all rentals at the Empire State Building and a member of that committee, enthusiastically told us, I have discovered in the Empire State Building space designated for education, and I'm holding it for the King's College. We were all dumbfounded, and at the same time, enormously intrigued. We all knew that the King's College was in no position to sign a lease agreement for space in the Empire State Building. There simply were no finances to do so. Yet could it be that God not only wanted us to think in terms of New York City as the place where to locate kings, but also let us know that he had already set aside teaching space in that landmark building? If so, then God would also make level the path that could lead to fulfilling that dream. And God did. You've all heard that ultimately, Campus Crusade for Christ made it possible for the King's College to resolve its financial dilemma and open its doors to students in the Empire State Building. But at the time I'm talking about, the period of our holding committee meetings in the Helmsley Conference Room, Campus Crusade was not part of this rescue mission. At least not as far as I or anyone else connected with the college or Campus Crusade knew. The truth is that at this very time, the chances for a new start for King's were dimming by the day. Plans were being made by the Lehman Brothers firm for conducting a foreclosure sale of the King's old campus in Westchester County. Those plans were moving forward irresistibly. But God, unbeknownst to us, was soliciting the support of Campus Crusade as his agent to accomplish the dreamer's vision. A phone call from somebody completely unknown to me, Stan Oakes, marked the beginning of the next chapter. Could he, if he came to New York, see me and talk about ways to help Kings? We hit it off, and I showed him the space in the Empire State Building, introduced him to various players in the battle for Kings, told him about the difficulties that had led to the closing of the institution, and filled him in on the foreclosure Kings was facing in the near future. When at our third or fourth meeting, Stan and I returned to our home in Tuxedo, this still being the pre-cell phone era, there was a message on our home phone from Dr. Bill Bright, the founder and president of Campus Crusade. Stan, get yourself a beeper. I've been trying to reach you all day to tell you that this morning in a meeting, the Lord brought to my mind the King's College with such force that I feel he wants us to go with it. A few weeks later, on the day before the one on which the foreclosure sale was to take place, Campus Crusade wired the necessary $100,000 that would permit our legal term to file for reorganization under the bankruptcy laws, effectively keeping the foreclosure from going forward. The lawyer representing Lehman Brothers argued in bankruptcy court, pointing at me and saying, this guy is suffering from, quote unquote, a case of terminal euphoria. Once the judge approved the reorganization plan for King's, and once the monies needed to enact that plan had been procured, King's emerged as a subsidiary of Campus Crusade and entered into a lease agreement with the Empire State Building. Not long after that, the college was reaccredited by the New York Board of Regents, and the credit for this miraculous restart of King's unashamedly and wholeheartedly goes to God, who made the path both visible and smooth. Now let's turn to today's topic, evil and the human conscience, and take a look at Max Frisch and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a very unlikely duo. Both are figures who experienced Hitler's rise, tyranny, and wars up close. Frisch from the safety of neighboring neutral Switzerland, and Bonhoeffer both from within and on occasion from without Germany. What they wrestled with was why so many people went along with the Nazi agenda and allowed evil to reap a bitter harvest. In many instances, this happened out of a desire for self-preservation, and sometimes because people failed to grasp the dangers of the ideology of the Third Reich. Max Frisch, in his play The Firebugs, questions the play's hero about his dubious role in not stopping, indeed enabling the arsonists to do their work of destruction. Quote, "He who dreads action more than disaster, how can he fight when disaster impends?" Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book on ethics, a book he couldn't publish during his lifetime, but one he worked on again and again, even while in prison, contrasts two men of action. The first driven by ideology, the other by faith. Quote, "The man who acts ideologically sees himself justified in his idea. The responsible man commits his action into the hands of God and lives by God's grace and favor." Max Frisch's play is set in a fairly small town where a group of arsonists is having a heyday. Numerous houses have burned down. Each day brings news of yet another arson crime. The local fire department is fully inadequate to the task. The mayor's office is pleading in vain with its citizens to alert the authorities to suspicious behavior of unsavory characters who are known to arrive at a person's front door on rusty bicycles and who smell of smoke. It is fear that moves the citizenry to cooperate with the arsonists rather than with the authorities. To Frisch's surprise, the play proved to be a great success, especially in Germany and also in England. Of course, it had its Broadway performance here in New York. Audiences readily saw the play as alluding to the Nazi era. Many Germans were still seeking for an answer to questions such as, why did we receive ideological arsonists into our homes when the danger was clear? How many of us actually cooperated with the Nazis even though we did not necessarily agree with their ideology? Because Max Frisch was a Swiss citizen, we Germans more readily could listen to this voice coming, as it were, from an outsider. Would anyone in his right mind receive arsonists into his home, assign them the attic, and as an expression of hypocritical friendship and wishful thinking, hand them matches? That is precisely what the hero of the play does. But does his display of tolerance even have the slightest chance of converting the arsonists into friends? Let's take a somewhat closer look at the comical plot, although by no means can the play be categorized as a comedy, and at the literary finesse Frisch employs to place the audience in a given theater at the proper distance from which to judge the actions of the play's characters. The main character, Mr. Biedermann, his name in German connotes solid honesty, if not sophistication, puts before the audience a rhetorical question, asking them what they would have done had they been in his shoes when the arsonists came to his front door and asked to be allowed to spend the night in his attic and to be treated humanely. He ends up treating the arsonists to a feast. He orders the maid to bring up the very best wines he has in his cellar, and briefly steps out of the on-stage dining room setting so he can address the audience in the theater. Quote, "You can think of me what you like, gentlemen, but just answer one question." There is laughter and there are voices. I say to myself, as long as they are laughing and drinking, we're safe. The best bottles out of my cellar. I tell you, if anybody had told me a week ago, when did you guess that they were arsonists, gentlemen? This sort of thing doesn't happen the way you think. It comes on you slowly, slowly at first, then sudden suspicion, But tell me the truth. Sirs, what would you have done if you were in my place? For God's sake. And when? When would you have done it? At what point? He waits for an answer. Silence. I must go back up now. Everyone in the theater realizes that had Biedermann reached out to the police or the fire department, the arsonist for sure would have set fire to his house. Doesn't everybody in the theater also realize that calling or not calling the police, the suspicious guests were going to commit arson anyway? That Mr. Biedermann was deluding himself, thinking that he and his wife were safe as long as his uninvited guests were drinking and cajoling? Frisch introduces us to the modern version of the classical chorus in Greek drama. It's through the chorus that he discusses the weak arguments of various characters. For instance, it's quite human to chalk off to fate the results of our actions or inactions for which we refuse to take responsibility. Firemen make up the chorus, the very firemen who have been spectacularly unsuccessful in their efforts to protect the town from the arsonists. That adds to the ridiculousness of the thesis that we as citizens have no way of fighting evil, are merely pawns in the game of fate. The truth is, of course, much simpler. The citizens, exemplified by Mr. Biedermann, could and should have supported the firemen rather than the arsonists, should have alerted the fire department when the arsonist arrived at the door. In the words of the chorus, quote, "Much goes up in flames, but not always because of fate. Stupidity alone can undo our citizens, our all too mortal citizens. Just because it happened, don't put the blame on God, nor on human nature. Just because it happened, must you call the damned thing fate?" The chorus exposes human tendency to call a disaster fate so as to avoid having to inquire into the real cause. Indeed, is it not merely a self-justifying excuse when we claim fate to be the culprit, rather than our lack of action against evil? That lack of courage is often given the name tolerance, yet is a far cry from true tolerance. It is Biedermann's wife, Babette, who, returning home, notices a rusty bicycle next to the front door and assumes that it belongs to the maid's boyfriend. She harbors no suspicion, even though she is aware of the great danger in her town. Next morning, when she meets the arsonist in her dining room, she asks him to leave the house. Still, the conversation with the arsonist and his plea for understanding and personal compassion disarm her totally, and she is no more successful in following through with her plan than was her husband the night before. The arsonist's charm touches Babette's soft heart and voids her attempt to show him the door. At this point in the play, the audience grasps the vast difference between legitimate tolerance for different cultures and traditions, a tolerance that is civil and much needed, and one that is generated by fear for our very lives, a tolerance that demands that we close our eyes and ears to evil. Thus, it will no longer surprise the audience that Biedermann, just having discovered that his attic is full of barrels filled with gasoline, protects the arsonist. When a policeman enters the room, he introduces the two arsonists as two of his employees and claims that the barrels contain hair tonic, the main product line of his business. Having become party to the arsonist's plan, Biedermann now is intent on winning them as friends. The play closes with Biedermann and his wife hosting the firebugs for dinner. This occurs in the evening before disaster strikes and is referred to as the Last Supper. Sirens go off and reflections of the fire in the night sky are visible on stage. Frisch did add a postscript for the play's first performance in Germany. A scene that is set at the entrance of hell and heaven. Biedermann and his wife, having been consumed by flames, wonder what, if anything, they did wrong, while the arsonists reveal their true identity as devils. There is a great deal of conversation going on among the characters, but no answers are forthcoming to what might be learned from such a tragic event. The best we get from the Biedermanns is this banal excuse: compared to others, we certainly are innocent. The play The Firebugs is an apt, albeit sad, commentary on what went wrong when in the 1930s and 40s citizens of Germany allowed Hitler to proceed with establishing an evil dictatorship in their land and to put into action the plan for setting up the ominous Holocaust. Frisch's message that giving in to evil out of fear must never be papered over with the names of tolerance or fate, because it's applicable to all of history. It seems only appropriate to contrast this kind of self-centered inaction with the teachings of a pastor and theologian who grappled profoundly with the same issue. Bonhoeffer experienced firsthand the destructive role of the Nazis, ideological arsonists as they were, and watched in horror when by far too many fellow pastors, both liberal and evangelical, acquiesced quietly to the demands put on them by the Third Reich. Finally, this young pastor debated with himself or not whether or not it was right and in keeping with Scripture to play an active role in attempting to assassinate Hitler. On 2 occasions in his ethics book, Bonhoeffer refers to an example that the famous 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant used to teach moral behavior. Imagine you are hiding a friend in your house, a friend who is being pursued by a murderer. Imagine further that the murderer shows up at your house and asks you whether you're hiding the victim he is pursuing. Given Kant's philosophical premises, you're going to answer honestly, even though such an answer will likely lead to your friend being murdered. It is easy to expand the example when it applies and apply it to the Hitler period, the situation when Germans or Dutch or Polish citizens were hiding in their houses political victims of the Nazi government, be they Jew or Gentile. The conclusion Bonhoeffer arrives at its opposite to that of Kant. He comes to his conclusion on the basis of biblical ethics. According to Bonhoeffer, in the above instance, you are obligated to lie, to make yourself guilty, because love for your friend so dictates. Your refusal to become guilty in that situation puts you into contradiction to what Christian responsibility demands. It is, of course, the example of Jesus that Bonhoeffer uses in his line of argumentation. Jesus, in coming to this earth out of love, became sin for us, so he could empower us to stand up against evil. Kant could easily and justifiably have answered that under no circumstances would Jesus have lied. Jesus is truth and always spoke the truth. Why then does Bonhoeffer so strongly disagree with Kant? And why do we today sense equally strongly that the betrayal of a Jew hidden during the Holocaust would have been very wrong, even treacherous? Bonhoeffer explains that Jesus, while living on this earth, was not so much concerned with his own goodness as he was with the fact that he had come to enter into the fellowship of our guilt. Quote, Jesus does not strive to be the only perfect one at our expense, does not seek to be the only one without guilt, unquote. This is a foundational theological insight. While Jesus never became guilty by making false claims or giving an untrue answer, he did become guilty by accepting our sins as his own. He allowed himself to be seen as a Sabbath breaker so he could do the right thing by those who needed healing or forgiveness. Bonhoeffer approaches Christian ethics not from an idealistic point of view, as did Kant, but from our realistic human predicament. I find this approach on the part of Bonhoeffer most freeing. After all, ethical actions are neither necessary nor do they occur in an atmosphere of sterility and moral perfection. They are needed in the polluted sphere of human guilt. Interestingly enough, the Kantian example to which Bonhoeffer refers is played out in Frisch's drama. Shouldn't Biedermann have spoken the truth to the policeman and told him of the true identity of the arsonist? And shouldn't he have spoken the truth about the content of the barrels in his attic? The context makes it clear that he became guilty not so much because he wanted to protect the arsonist, rather because he hoped to protect his life and his house. The funny thing here is that Biedermann lies because he wants to persuade the arsonist to become his friends. He is not motivated by any ethical standards, but by fear alone. Bonhoeffer, on the other hand, left his teaching position in New York City where he was free to pursue theological research and writing without any limits on his personal freedom of safety, and returned to Hitler's Germany because he was motivated by love of neighbor, even if that meant becoming enmeshed in suffering and getting his hands dirty because he would have to live by biblical standards that were diametrically opposed to Nazi ideology. Bonhoeffer acted responsibly. The German pastor summarizes his ethical conviction with these beautiful words: "He who incurs guilt while acting responsibly, and no responsible person can avoid becoming guilty, accepts this guilt as his own, does not blame anyone else, stands up for it, and takes responsibility for it." The story of the harlot Rahab comes to mind here. It is recorded in the book of Joshua. She hid 2 Israeli spies in her Jericho house and lied about their being there when confronted by the authorities. Before she sends off the spies after the authorities have left, she defends her lying with these memorable words: "I showed you mercy, now show my family mercy." She believes that her action in hiding the spies makes her a willing tool in God's hand. How else could the book of Hebrews celebrate her as a heroine of faith? The exercise of juxtaposing Mr. Biedermann and his inaction in a town under siege by a group of arsonists with Bonhoeffer, the sacrificial pastor in a country under siege by a party of ideological arsonists, provides us with a useful grid. Biedermann, by his selfish behavior, merely contributed to the demise of his community. He does not need to be remembered, except in the sense that he represents all too well the average citizen, one who easily chooses to go along with evil to save his own life. Bonhoeffer, on the other hand, chose a path of resistance. He lost his life, but left us with his ethics. That book does not so much offer a set of rules under the rubric of oughtness. Rather, it describes ethical behavior that springs forth from the core of one's being as a follower of Jesus, one's courage to do right when standing against evil is called for. I will close with the story of Carl von Weizsäcker, a leading nuclear physicist and a follower of Jesus, who during the Hitler years worked with a team of experts in Berlin to develop and build an atomic bomb. It was a race against time. For teams of scientists in other countries, including the United States, were involved in such research during that very period. As the research in Berlin progressed and the size of the destructive force of such a bomb began to take on ominous dimensions, the question on the minds of some members of the Berlin team, including von Weizsäcker, was, What if Germany were to succeed in building this destructive device before anyone else? Wouldn't that mean that Hitler could and would commit widespread arson? So what was von Weizsäcker to do? How could he stop the evil arsonist Hitler? He could simply have resigned his position and accepted imprisonment for disloyalty. But refusing to remain involved in this research would not have prevented the nuclear bomb from being developed. Something else was needed. By choosing to remain a member of the research team, he could and would exercise passive resistance, an active way of slowing down the process with the goal of depriving Hitler of his great desire to be the first in this world to get hold of the ultimate weapon. 1957, 12 years after the war, was when I first heard the name of Karl von Weizsäcker. In the spring of that year, Germany's newspapers reported that von Weizsäcker, at the time a professor of physics at the University of Göttingen, along with 17 other scientists, had asked the new German government to denounce the use of nuclear power altogether and to promise not to use their research toward destructive purposes. Their weapon, they all would resign their research and teaching positions if the government did not agree to their demands. Here were people, 18 scientists, willing to stand their ground. I and many of my friends were impressed. The German government could not give in, and the 18 scientists resigned their positions. When the fall semester 1957 began, at the time, I, along with two of my cousins, were students at the University of Hamburg. We were astonished to read the bulletin notice that this famous Karl von Weizsäcker had been appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Hamburg, and he would give his inaugural lecture in the school's largest auditorium. The three of us were determined to hear this man who had stood up for what he believed. I will never forget Karl von Weizsäcker making his way to the lectern to loud student applause. In keeping with German university tradition, that applause came in the form of stamping our feet. And I can still hear in my mind the opening sentence of his lecture. My philosophy begins with the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. We were challenged that day to use the Word, the Bible, both as a measure for what is true and as a guide for what is the right thing to do. A professor who lived what he taught. Almost 20 years later, I was by now serving as dean of the faculty at Lake Forest College in Illinois. Karl von Weizsäcker's name came to my attention again. The Austrian poet and playwright Frank Zwillinger visited the college. I enjoyed long conversations with this Jewish writer. A friendship developed between us that was to last for many years. As a Jew, he had left Vienna the very night Hitler in 1938 announced the annexation of Austria and spent the war years in Vietnam. As his plays, particularly his play about the life of Galileo, were well received on the main stage of Vienna, the Burgtheater, he wrote a drama entitled Chain Reaction. It's about the development of the atom bomb. And Karl von Weizsäcker plays a role in it, a very strange role. We see him on stage. We hear him being talked about, but we don't ever hear him utter a single word. Very appropriate for a passive resistor. It's about him and about the question whether he actually had taken steps during the war to prevent the A-bomb from being built in Berlin, or whether he had, after all, remained loyal to Hitler and merely claimed after the war to have delayed the building of the bomb by practicing passive resistance. Given the nature of passive resistance, there is little evidence, if any. Outwardly, he had to maintain loyalty to Hitler and to the cause of the Nazis if he was to be successful in demanding more tedious research simply to delay, or if he kept papers in his desk and let time go by before passing them on so the next step in this research would be taken later than planned. Every step demanded great caution so the plot of passive resistance would not be discovered. And it worked. The bomb did not get built in Hitler's Germany. Wasn't that good enough? My Jewish friend, the author of this drama, has the leader of that eminent research team in Berlin, Werner Heisenberg by name, vouch for the truthfulness of Karl von Weizsäcker. Quote, besides my friend von Weizsäcker and myself, there are about 10 German physicists who in this respect are of one mind. We know that we have to disassemble our working on the nuclear war machine. That is the only solution. The play ends with a question left hanging in the air. It is again Heisenberg who puts it before the audience. Quote, how shall we explain after the war our actions so that both the Allied forces as well as the German people will voice their approval? True, Karl von Weizsäcker had to live for the rest of his life, he died in 2007 at the age of 94, with questions being asked about his role as a member of this A-bomb research project that Hitler had commissioned. He never ceased to credit divine grace with preventing the nuclear bomb from being built in Berlin during the war. There is no doubt in my mind that Karl von Weizsäcker did indeed use his power to prevent the nuclear bomb from becoming a reality before the war came to an end. Nor is there any doubt that during the war, as a member of this great brain trust, he did not outwardly show any signs of being disloyal to Hitler. He knew that evil had been stopped effectively by the grace of God. Reading Bonhoeffer's Ethics, I have the strong sense that he had the Karl von Weizsäcker example in mind when drawing an almost causal relationship between responsible action, as he calls it, and incurring guilt. That, however, was not the case. It is simply that living ethically by biblical standards, so Bonhoeffer maintains, often means that we get our hands dirty, especially so when in the face of evil we do the right thing. Legally, Karl von Weizsäcker had made himself guilty by dissembling loyalty to Hitler when as a saboteur he undermined the effectiveness of his colleagues on the team. Doing the right thing had to go hand in hand with being disloyal to Hitler while dissembling loyalty. That is precisely what Dietrich Bonhoeffer meant with the words I quoted earlier and will now quote again. He who incurs guilt while acting responsibly, and no responsible person can avoid becoming guilty, accepts this guilt as his own, does not blame anyone else, stands up for it, and takes responsibility for it. Thank you.
So in the dichotomy of this world being composed of largely people that are not Christians, do you think it is better for those that lack Christian ethics to act, or is it better for them, should we wish for them as Christians to not act if they were to act upon ethics that are not Christian, and those ethics could be imposed in a negative way?
I think Bonhoeffer, of course, wants to make the point that if you're not just a being comfortable, quiet corner Christian, you would really go out there and face the danger. And you can do so better because God enables you to do it. It's like the question that may have come to you sometime. The question that Jesus asks of you. Has it ever happened to any of you that you almost heard the voice of Jesus saying, are you willing to do what I want you to do, even if it means becoming sort of like Rahab. And doing the thing that outwardly is wrong, but it's right, because it elevates the truth and the power of the gospel.
Is a form of consequentialism or something else?
Or
A form of
something-
a form of consequentialism or some other kind of ethical theory?
well, of course he was influenced by what he experienced around him. But you know, Bonhoeffer had some very good teachers. And one of them was Adolf Schlatter in Tübingen, who just, if you can read Schlatter in German, it's a very romantic style of writing. But it's a beautiful, deep interpretation of Scripture. And I think Bonhoeffer had listened to him. He had listened to the more pietistic side of the Christian faith, and therefore understood it more deeply. We think of pietists sort of as people who are just pious with themselves, right? But if you take the founder of pietism, Zinzendorf, he wrote over 2,000 hymns. He wrote them just on a piece of paper. He could translate them into Latin, or wrote them in Latin. He had written a prosody of German verse. These guys were highly educated, very informed about what was going on. And they just weren't sitting there and let that happen. No, they took action. But it is consequential, yes. But it is also true Christian interpretation.
Thank you so much for this lecture. It was just brilliant.
Thank you, Bob.
And I have a question about New York City's influence on Bonhoeffer. I know he spent time here. Americans love to believe that he was shaped here, but but especially Abyssinian Baptist Church.
Yes, yes. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think Bonhoeffer would ever have become that kind of Christian had it not been for the experience here, because except for Schlatter, he had many liberal theologians that would never have touched his heart or mind. You know, I just, your president just asked me this morning, or mentioned the thing, and I mentioned it. When Karl von Weizsäcker was introduced that day in the lecture hall at the University of Hamburg, he was introduced by someone whom some of you at least know quite well, Helmut Thielicke. And Helmut Thielicke is a theologian. Now, I remember having invited Helmut Thielicke to a meeting we had at the seminary where the Baptist Student League of the university got together. So there we were, maybe 50 or so, and Helmut Thielicke had come. And one of the questions we asked, how was it during the war? What happened to you? And he talked about, as I have heard several formerly liberal theologians talk about, how the war made them read Scripture more closely. And they had the experience that they had never had before of being born again. What Bonhoeffer had here at the Abyssinian Church. And what was their big surprise? Thielicke said it. Our biggest surprise was that we wanted now to be close to the evangelical community in Germany. And they didn't want to have anything to do with us because they were afraid of Hitler. Again, the same story, just a different aspect of it.